Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to the Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 5 of season 1 of HBO's Westworld. Join me, will you? So, even while I must admit that this week's episode of Westworld did once again fail to craft or shape its characters in ways that I found all that identifiable or relatable, which primarily comes from the writer's continued insistence on each of them being these slowly explored enigmas, I will, however, give the show this. It does craft episodes that are unified in theme and idea, which usually does produce a rather satisfying 55-minute experience. And this week, the theme that they chose to focus on was that of dissatisfaction, specifically in a chosen path and what could have been and what could be were a different one chosen. And that dissatisfaction was first seen in the Greyhound and Ford's story. And to connect that canine to our show, on one level that dog represented the hosts, forced to run in circles their entire life, chasing something that they believed they could and one day would reach, while Ford's younger brother in the story was like Arnold, naively underestimating the power and speed of his dog as he led it off the leash. Though one of the more interesting reveals this week was that it wasn't naivete at all on Arnold's part that prompted him to let the androids off the leash and destroy his park, which brings us to the second group that dissatisfied canine represented. All mankind. Indeed, there must have been a measure of dissatisfaction within Arnold that he sought to destroy something that he surely invested years into. And we saw this week that his departure seemed to have left an emptiness and dissatisfaction within Ford as well, which has trickled down not only into his hosts, but also the guests that visit the park. And so acute was that dissatisfaction within Ford that he chose not to wipe Dolores' mind or completely purge from her robotic system the ability to remember his old partner and what happened to him. Because, whether he liked it or not, telling stories to hosts and remaining safely disconnected from the world just wasn't enough for Ford. And even as William, upon seeing Pariah, recognized, you get the feeling that the designers don't think much of people. We still saw that Ford was not utterly resolved in that disposition. There was disappointment, and again, dissatisfaction on his face when he asked old Bill if he had seen a greyhound, and the host merely recited, "I've seen a few showdowns in my day." And as the camera held on old Bill just those few extra seconds during Ford's story, we, along with the creator, were meant to believe that maybe, just maybe, that old android was processing and actually being affected by the interaction. And we and Ford together were meant to feel disappointment when he robotically responded, "Shall we drink to the lady with the white shoes?" And again, we saw the same sort of disappointment and pain in Ford's eyes when he chose to deny any sort of friendship between he and Dolores. And because of all of that, as well as the fact that Bernard's voice morphed into Ford's when Dolores heard, "May you rest in a deep and dreamless sleep," I continue to believe that Ford has his own agenda to help the androids achieve consciousness. It just doesn't seem like a mistake at all that Ford's very revolutionary ideology has seeped so thoroughly into his creation's mechanical psyches. Ford's belief, for example, that dreams meant everything and that they were these stories that we told ourselves of what could be, had all but become Dolores' anthem. And she'd now grown to the point where, instead of just robotically repeating that exact phrase, she presented it in her own words, saying to William, for example, "I've been wondering if there aren't many paths, choices that hang there like ghosts, and if you could just see them, you could change your whole life." And indeed, throughout this episode, Dolores did see numerous ghost-like flashes of herself choosing different paths, and in following them continued to alter her life significantly. And actually, in an abstract sort of way, her journey is visualized week after week in the opening credits. So for a time, she was merely those compliant hands that unwittingly played that piano, not knowing that it was in fact playing them. And like its melody, her life looped over and over. And that loop, in a way, was the wall that protected her mind, or her garden, and even death couldn't touch the flowers there. But again, like those opening credits, the gun was eventually brought into her life and placed into her hands, used reluctantly back in episode 3 and with much more assurance and purpose this week. And those developments have really shown no sign of slowing either, this episode continuing to set up the idea that Dolores will one day not only choose a new path for herself, but for all the hosts. And we saw this specifically in how she was handed all the guns during that nitroglycerin heist, as well as how she was able to identify with Lawrence, even if just for a moment, over the fact that they were both seeking something. All of which just continued to assure me that even as Dolores didn't destroy the park 30 years ago for Arnold, doesn't mean that she won't. Interestingly though, it wasn't just androids that seemed to be guided by Dolores this week. William continuing to identify with her and see in her what he wanted to be, which finally revealed fully why he chose to come on this trip to begin with. He so longed for a place that he could change, but without judgment, or really without anyone in the outside world knowing. And a powerful example of that hold that Dolores has over him came at the episode's end, when William, before turning away from the real flesh and blood Logan and taking the synthetic hand of an android, declared, "No more pretending." That fake place and that mechanical girl had now become more real to him than his real life, soon-to-be, brother-in-law, as crummy of a person as he was. Though Logan wasn't completely useless this week, revealing certain tidbits about Arnold's supposed suicide, the fact that his lawyers couldn't even find an image of him, and that his company was considering buying Westworld. He introduced, too, what he believed to be the game, War, which I'm guessing will at least be a significant part of the finale. And still slowly moving in that same direction was the Man in Black. Though this week especially, that character actually felt like he had the most in common with that Greyhound, most especially after it had caught that cat. For both that racing dog and that man, the chase and the pursuit had been what had given them purpose and meaning their entire life. And when there was no more need to chase or to pursue, and when they held in their teeth the very thing that they thought they desired most, they had no idea what to do. And the idea of that catch-22 was so perfectly encapsulated in this episode's title as well. Contrapasso, which is a Latin word that basically means suffer the opposite and refers specifically to the punishment endured in Dante's Inferno, where souls are granted the very thing that they chose in life, but there find it to produce nothing but suffering and emptiness. And the more that I learn about the Man in Black, the more I'm convinced that in the outside world anyways, he's already caught his cat, so to speak. He himself describing the world out there as one of plenty, and even so, finding it still incredibly unsatisfying. And the more I hear about his worldview, the more I'm convinced that he will never be satisfied. Because while he's constantly talked about his love of Westworld coming from the fact that everything in it was designed, he's also, in a very contradictory way, not been satisfied with those contrivances. After all, the whole reason that he's on the journey that he is because he wants to find something true. And this contradiction was only reinforced when he said to Teddy, "You used to be beautiful, a million little perfect pieces. And then they changed you, made you this sad, real mess. Flesh and bone, just like us." So, does he want a designed machine or a true human? I don't think you can have both at the same time. And furthermore, seeing those backstage who are either utterly despicable, caricatured individuals, or simply unable to keep others from tampering with their androids or smuggling out the park's data, just makes me think all the more this guy is really going to be disappointed with the Wizard of Oz. Nonetheless, just like that song that played in the bar after Ford left, the Man in Black continues to frenetically sprint towards the next cat. And indeed, the question still does remain for us, will this show become our contrapasso, so to speak, providing us answers, but ones that we find ultimately to be dissatisfying and series ruining? I suppose only time will tell, but I personally am very excited to see what's going to happen next. Those are my thoughts anyways on this week's episode of Westworld. I would love to know what you guys thought of the episode though, so definitely comment below and let me know. Any favorite characters or favorite plot lines so far? I would love to hear all about it. And finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.